Hey guys, so these past 2 weekends, I spent some time dabbling in the Diablo 4 beta. And I do mean dabbling. I didn't spend my entire weekend grinding every class to level 25, but I did manage to get 2 of them to level 25, and clear the beta twice. By the way, this is coming from the perspective of someone who isn't a die-hard ARPG fan, but I do enjoy these types of games, and I do play a lot of them. I'm just not the type to come back every season to regrind the whole game again. My goals tend to be to try out all the classes, and then beat the game on the hardest difficulty. Anyways, I played the beta on the Xbox Series X with controller, and that's just because I prefer to play on console whenever I can. So let's take a look at this beta. The good, the bad, and the ugly. So let's start with the good. I actually really enjoyed the narrative here, which doesn't happen very often whenever I play an ARPG. For whatever reason, they just never connect with me. I usually don't care about what's going on, or about the characters. My motivation to push through is to get all of the loot, and then beat the game on the hardest difficulty. But the opening cutscene for Diablo 4 was so good that it actually made me care. They got their hooks into me, and I couldn't be happier about that. Because I want to enjoy the narratives. I play RPGs because I am a narrative junkie. It's fantastic when you can get lost in the world and story. And even after that spectacular opening cutscene, I thought the narrative remained strong throughout the beta, and by the time it was over, I was invested and wanted to know what comes next. The controls are also amazing. They are so responsive, and it just feels so good moving around. The way the abilities go off is also really solid. The animations and sound effects come together and create this really great feeling of impact that makes it really fun turning your enemies into paper mache. And really, that's not too surprising. Blizzard have always excelled at this. Like, when you look at World of Warcraft, you can say what you will about other aspects of the game, the controls and how abilities go off is very smooth and probably the best in the market. I also love that there's a dedicated dodge button. It's an action RPG. You should be able to dodge around enemy attacks without needing to dedicate precious skill points to do so. So a big part of the fun in Diablo is, of course, getting the loot. And I just love that all the loot just takes one slot in your inventory. Another great feature is you can actually save legendary affixes and then apply them to other gear. This removes that awful feeling you get when an amazing legendary drops at a low level, because you no longer have to pray to the RNG gods to get that drop again. So the last thing for the good is I like that the skill tree is relatively simple, at least compared to Path of Exile, where I felt like to navigate that skill tree, you really needed a guide. But that's not to say there isn't complexity, it's just that it comes from figuring out how to build your character based on what loot you got. Which is something I really like. You know, it keeps things interesting. It incentivizes you to change up your build as you go through the game. And because the skill tree is simple, it won't be a pain whenever you want to change things up. Now, one thing that I would add is a way to save different builds and gear loadouts. That is such a quality of life thing, and I was actually surprised that it wasn't there. So that was the good, and to continue with the theme, let's now take a look at the bad. In this case, nitpicks. So let's start with the character creator. It's very bare-boned, especially for a AAA game in 2023. Now, I wasn't expecting Neo levels of customization, and I know it's not super important for a game where you hardly ever see your character up close. I still would have loved to see more options, especially with the hairstyles. Another nitpick I have is I really don't like that the enemies level with you. I think that destroys your sense of progression. For me, an integral part of RPGs is the power progression. Whenever you level, you get stronger, and then you can go back to enemies that made your life a living hell and mercilessly destroy them. That is such a cathartic feeling, and that feeling is compromised in Diablo 4 because every time you level, you feel weaker. A lot of the gear you got becomes outdated with each passing level, so the enemies become tougher and you feel less powerful. Speaking of gear, another nitpick I have is, it can be really hard to know when gear is an actual upgrade. With all the different stats and multipliers, and how gear interacts with your abilities, I don't know. It almost feels like you have to guess if a new piece of gear is actually better. The last nitpick I have is, I don't like where they place the health and mana globes on the Xbox. It's on the lower left side of the screen, and that's not a very natural place for me to look. I think we should have the option to move it to the center, like on PC. So that would be all the nitpicks I have, so now let's move on to the ugly. So while I generally enjoyed the combat, there was a problem, and that was when I went melee. And I really hate to say that because I love playing melee. I like being up close and personal. But there were many times in the beta where being melee just felt awful. Like, some random enemies are very annoying, and there were also some bosses that were truly trying my patience. Such as bosses that are constantly running away from you, and they knock you back whenever you get too close. And they also bind you in place. And just to add insult to injury, they also love dropping danger puddles all around them, forcing you to wait at ranged with nothing to do. Not exactly my idea of a good time. You know, when I was playing a ranged DPS, I didn't notice any of that. But this seems to always happen with Blizzard. Playing ranged is almost always the better choice. So next up, let's talk about the dungeons. In particular, the optional side dungeons. So there were 22 side dungeons to do in the beta, and I ran about half of them. I wanted to do them all, but I was becoming burned out. The dungeons I ran were all very similar, and it started to feel really repetitive. I think maybe I was spoiled by Lost Ark a little bit here. In that game, the dungeons were pretty unique. I feel like Blizzard went quantity over quality here. They wanted a lot of dungeons to fill out the open world with, which is something you see a lot with these kind of games. And even though I said optional at the start, they aren't really optional. You are going to feel compelled to do them for map completion, and they also offer imprints as rewards. Imprints are affixes that you can add to a piece of gear, transforming them into a legendary, so you're probably going to want to collect them all. So guys, that was my impression of the beta. I would say overall, it was pretty fun, and I am going to play it when it releases. There were problems, some more ugly than others, but the story has me intrigued, and the gameplay is generally fun. Especially if you go ranged. I am very curious to see what the endgame will be like, but if I'm being perfectly honest, ARPG endgame tends to be where I start to lose interest. And if that happens here, I think that's fine. Not every game needs to be something that you play forever. Maybe you just come back for the big updates, or whenever an expansion releases. Anyways, that will be all for this one. Thank you all so much for watching. Please like, comment, and subscribe. And until next time, bye!